Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Your glance at sex, society, and culture.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome to the 10th episode of the Peep Show podcast. This is a special episode coming out of the BDYHAX Convention in Austin, Texas. The convention is a 3-day celebration of human enhancement, transhumanism, and body hacking that brings together industry experts, curious newcomers, and everyone in between. This year, the convention featured a SexTech Friday event that we thought would be particularly relevant to our listeners. Because this is a special episode, we are not going to begin with a news segment. Instead, we will start with a brief interview with Convention Director Trevor Goodman. Then we will bring some field recordings of conversations with attendees. Then we will feature interviews with Angel Giuffria, who was this year's host, and Hilary Malatino, who was an invited speaker. Okay, we are at the BDYHAX Convention in Austin, Texas, and we have with us Trevor Goodman. They are the convention director of BDYHAX and was also the co-founder of it. So welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about the event itself?
Yeah, BDYHAX in general is about body hacking, human augmentation, biohacking in that space. What we mean when we say body hacking is specifically bringing the maker, hacker, DIY ethos and methods to your body, treating the body as a system, understanding it, and making it do what you want. So that's also democratizing and personalizing health. So it's just about anything you can do with your body.
Can you give 2 or 3 concrete examples of what body hacking would be?
I think probably the simplest ones, the ones that everybody wants to look at and point to is, obviously we consider prosthetics an extension of your body. They're a tool that you use to try to interact with your environment.
There's a number of people with prosthetics here.
There are a number of people with prosthetics here. We've got people with cochlear implants. We've got people with cool arms and cool blinky legs too. So prosthetics are great, but almost everybody in the U.S. takes nootropics in the form of caffeine. Caffeine is the most obvious and accessible nootropic. What nootropics are, they're chemicals that affect your brain function. So most people will take caffeine so they feel more alert and they feel smarter and they feel like they're more capable human beings. That's body hacking.
PJ is drinking his coffee while you're speaking.
Coffee, there you go. That's a good one.
It was totally a Pavlovian reaction.
The implantables are always really interesting. Wearable tech is fun, but there are a lot of people who really like putting it under their skin too. So whether it's wearables or whether it's implantable tech, I think they're also body hacking.
Great. We are a sex podcast, and so we came specifically for the SexTech Friday, which we understand is new this year. So can you tell us why you added that?
Yeah, we generally have a rotating special event on Friday for things that we want to draw special attention to or we want to break out of the rest of the conference. One of the reasons why I haven't put this content in front of people on the main stage track is because a lot of people are uncomfortable with the space. A lot of people don't necessarily want to have sex shoved in front of them at every conference they walk into. A lot of events have that issues. And so one of the things we want to do is separate that out into its own night so people could participate or they could not participate. But also because we think that this is a space that's ignored, especially in the U.S. here, because people are so afraid of it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of things that we attribute to sex or reproductive health or other things like that aren't considered body hacking. So Rose Eveleth in 2016, she identified a problem that we have is that we don't consider things like IUDs or birth control to be body hacking. We don't consider them to be technology.
Even though IUDs are implantable.
Right. Even though IUDs are the implantable technology
yeah.
that people have been using for a long time.
Right.
And hormones are huge. And it's not just replacing normal hormone function. There are trans people who have been taking hormones to adjust their bodies to the state that makes them more comfortable for a long time.
Sure.
But we don't generally look at these populations because they're women or because they're trans people or because they're disabled people. We don't look at those populations and say, oh, you're body hacking. We say like, oh, you're fixing a thing that's wrong with you.
Yeah.
Or it's just what everybody does. So we were talking about prosthetics earlier. I actually consider makeup and Botox and breast implants and plastic surgery in general, and all of those things are aesthetic prosthetics. Like really the point is to make yourself more attractive to the people around you so that you can stimulate a specific social reaction.
Sure.
When Rose wrote this article, she was pointing out a lot of these different things and that why don't we consider them though? She came to the conference a couple years ago and she talked to people, and even people here said, I don't know if I think IUDs are body hacking. It's like, what are you talking about? These people are completely changing the way that their reproductive health functions. Right. I mean, normally if you got implanted with sperm and you had eggs that were fertile and ready to go, then you would be pregnant. having control over that is by its very nature body hacking. You're modifying your body.
Right. And it actually it doesn't just prevent you from being pregnant, but it completely changes your cycles and it changes everything.
Totally. My wife had to get off her IUDs because she was on a hormonal IUD and it was giving her depression. So, I mean, like, when we make these changes to our bodies, they're not limited to the specific things we're trying to do. And so a lot of the things that we're trying to do here is to draw attention to those and say, make intentional choices, whether that's about your sex or your reproductive health or whether that's about other things in your body.
Yeah, one of the things you said that I thought was so interesting is how we perceive body hacking. The idea that if the kind of hacking that's being done is to address some sort of perceived social problem, whether it's an issue related to fertility or infertility, whether it's related to gender identity or, difference in ability, that those things get categorized just under the umbrella of medicine. And then the way that body hacking seems to be socially perceived is it has to be like for fun or trivial or weird or something, but it's like, in a way, it gets pulled outside of the umbrella of broader social issues.
Definitely, a lot of people think my definition of body hacking is too broad, and it probably is too broad to be functional, but in a way, that's my point.
Yeah.
But any other definitions of the term is completely just shifting boundaries and goalposts based upon whatever society thinks is acceptable at that time.
Yeah.
You can fly across the other side of the world and have a completely different perspective. There are a ton of people who are doing chip implants and stuff in Sweden. It's just not a big deal. No one cares.
Right.
And it's because we have a different perspective around what we do with our bodies.
No, I think that the example of IUDs are really interesting too, because people use those to not get pregnant, but female body trans people also use them to stop their periods. Right. And so the fact that you use those for like widely different purposes, I think is also very interesting.
Right. I mean, well, it's very hackery.
Yeah.
Trans people have had to find ways to hack their bodies.
Sure.
Have had to find ways to create estrogen when doctors won't prescribe it to them.
Right.
It's readily available in our environment. You can filter it out of your tap water if you want.
Right.
So there are a lot of solutions, but most of them get more towards this hacky maker DIY feel and moves more further away from the medical industry.
I think that's very interesting. I want to go back to what you were talking about in terms of pulling the sex out of the conference and putting it all in one, kind of segregating it. Yeah. I think that's interesting. And I was curious, as a conference director, did you find that people opted out of that or that there was a lot of interest in it?
I think I was surprised on both directions. I think I expected more people to show up for certain parts of it. And I do know that there were some people who didn't attend at all because of the content.
Huh.
So it's interesting. I think sex is still in that space for a lot of people here in the U.S.
Yeah.
That it's not a thing that they want to talk about in public.
Right. Yeah.
Right. It's not a thing they want to hear about in public.
Right.
Let alone do in public.
Some people, but that's a different event.
No,
yeah.
we actually, and I say that
those parties are generally not this public.
I say that partially tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually something we talk about a great deal on the podcast is sex publics. And while that's true, I mean, we just came from AVN and, it was just a giant, several-day sex public that people were talking about sex nonstop. And
they were filming there and there was an exchange of content.
Yeah, absolutely. But even like as we exist in sort of this more cyborganic, I know I like it. I feel it's an underused word. It's actually not a word, but I use it.
No, it's good.
It's actually funny because cyborg is shortened version of cybernetic organism. So if you say cyborg organism, you're just shortening the cyber part.
No, it's true.
Let's nerd out here.
But what I was going to say
I do geek out about this stuff. Sorry.
As we develop more and more intimate relationships with our technology and become more cyborganic, we are actually able to engage in sex publics in like very interesting ways, like cam rooms and even like what we call Switter, which is like sex work Twitter, or porn communities on Tumblr and Twitter and Snapchat and all these other things. I feel like there is like an emergence of various sex publics. So, I did say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I also think it's interesting to think about how
technology creates sex publics.
Yeah, and new spaces for us to both engage in and talk about sex in a public way, but maybe not in the kind of conventional face-to-face way.
Well, I mean, the thing about those spaces is they're opt-in, right?
Right,
Like,
sure.
And so this is what I wanted to do, is like create an opportunity for people to opt in to be ready for this content, because like shoving it in front of people's faces isn't usually like the helpful thing. It's like if you go have sex out on the street, they're going to call the police and you'll go to jail.
Right.
Giving people that choice, I think, it makes them more receptive to the information.
Sure. Yeah.
But I mean, there's sex everywhere. I mean, like you drive down the road and there's sex on billboards and there's sex on TV, and like even when it's not nudity and actual physical acts of intimacy, it's still like it's there.
Right. Yeah, I think that there's something like schizophrenic about our culture in particular, coming out of this puritanical history, that there is a fear around sexuality, but that it is everywhere at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's the way you control your population. It's the way you control the people who live in your society. So, I mean, those are some of the things we talked about on the panels last night. It got a little heady. But, I mean, that's really the point.
What do you think were the most interesting questions? That you did say it got a little heady, and in a certain way it did get a little bit heady, but in ways that I think were also productive. So I'm curious what you thought were the most interesting conversations that came out of last night.
I think the most interesting conversations were people hearing from the perspective of an intersex person in the space, because really that's where we do start touching on like the medical industry and deciding how certain people should express in their bodies, right? And trying to force people into one of these categories of performing or being performed to.
Right.
So all of those things are really interesting. I was really excited to get Hilary up on stage. Their perspective, both as an academic who studies technology and cyborg theory and stuff like that, but also as an intersex person, was really great.
Yeah, we're actually going to have them on this episode. So
cool. Okay, well,
we're going to continue to talk about this. So I'm glad you brought it up.
There's bio-art spaces and biohacking spaces that are working on trying to make hormones accessible to people inexpensively. So if doctors don't prescribe them, they're trying to help people figure out ways to, create estrogen in their kitchen, or to make chickens lay eggs that contain extra estrogen. And there's even, with CRISPR getting more popular, there's even a bunch of gene therapy projects that people are working on for gene therapy modifications that would effectively make a person intersex. So, I mean, there's desire to push bodies into those spaces, even though the medical community is saying at the same time, hey, this is a thing that we should stop and we should fix.
Yeah, actually, it's really interesting to hear you say that, because that has been the medical model, is to take intersex people and push them to one side or the other.
The medical industry wants to fix.
Binary.
They always want to fix a thing and then say, we're done and go away.
Right. And to fix a thing, you first have to create that thing as a problem.
Yeah,
right?
It has to be broken for you to fix it first.
And sometimes that means defining it as a problem when people didn't define it as a problem before.
Right. Well, and defining it as a problem for someone else rather than letting them say, this is a thing that I need to work on or I want to work on.
Right.
Exactly.
So the stuff around the medical industry in this space was really interesting and really good, and kind of where I wanted things to go with that panel anyway. So that's always the most exciting thing to me, because I haven't really interfaced with the medical industry a whole lot. I'm a reasonably healthy person. I hardly go to the doctor. I've gone to the hospital for a knee infection once. Like, I mean, I'm lucky. And so that perspective is sometimes alien to me. And so sometimes it's good to be reminded of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that was one of the really interesting things that did come out of that panel, was to kind of problematize that pathologizing of bodies.
Right.
So what kind of sex tech related body hacks are you most excited about?
A lot of the technologies that were being talked about were technologies that a lot of people in the audience felt were very male-centric.
Yes.
And especially a lot of the female-bodied people. I think that all of this technology is really interesting, but the kind of questions that need to be pushed forward now is like, who are these technologies for? How are we going to make them inclusive of like a lot of differently bodied people?
I mean, these are the same problems we have with everything,
sure,
right? Like, we need more women run businesses. We need more women in STEM. And really, sex tech is kind of changing that. There are a lot of women in this space who are designing a lot of things. There are a lot of non-binary people who are in this space and designing things.
Sure.
But we still have this pattern of like, all the sex toys are for penises, or like, all the porn is for penises or for male-bodied people.
Yeah, I think that's why this is actually a really great thing to do, because you can open up this sort of discussion of like, whose bodies are these for?
I mean, I don't have a solution for any of it.
Sure.
Right. But I mean, really the thing is we just need more people to build stuff that they think is cool. and to help other people build stuff that they think is cool.
Yeah, and I think also that's probably why these forums for conversation are important too, because I think they help foster empathy and like help people to see beyond the limitations of their own embodied experience and think about what pleasure might be like, or what the embodied experience of other people might be like, from that other perspective.
Really, it's about the market. Like,
Sure.
Who do they think are going to buy these things? And that's what they're building things for. If they thought women would buy these things, then they would be building them for women.
Right.
Because I really think it's ambivalent. I think it's amoral, and I don't think they care.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's part of the problem.
Yeah, I take that, because you have the same issue in pornography, that there's a lot of really creative, like queer and pornographers.
Who are dying to make great content when they get the chance they do.
Feminist pornographers, but there's not the same market there. They can't make as much money. So I take your point. We can wrap this up. Can you tell people who are interested in the conference for next year how to find you guys?
Yeah, the best way to find us for now is at BDYHAX on Twitter. That's BDYHAX, or bodyhacks.com. So again, that's BDYHAX.com.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate having y'all out.
In addition to interviewing the convention director, the host, and the speaker, PJ and I also spent some time talking to audience members and conference participants about who they are and what they are doing at BDYHAX. While this sample may not be totally representative and probably reflects our humanities biases, it will at least give you a flavor of the con.
Name's Amy Danzy. I'm from Dallas. I guess I kind of came here because I have RFID implant. I'm kind of involved in some of that technology. I'm a software developer. Let's be honest, it's not the worst thing I've had in my body. Yeah, so I'm just kind of interested in all of this and like the actual people that are using them for like medical and not just because they want them. So it's kind of interesting. So like you use Apple Pay or any of that type of stuff on your phone, that's a RFID or an NFC technology. Okay. So I have that chip in my hand, and you can program it. It holds 888 bytes of data, and has my contact info. So like it'll open a web page and take you to my web page. It unlocks my front door. There's some things for like cryptocurrency and being able to pay for stuff.
Do you like it?
Yeah, I want more.
Yeah?
Yeah, that's actually, I thought like there would be more of that kind of stuff here, but it's a little, maybe not as technical here. It's more of like ethical. So that's kind of interesting.
My name is Raina, and I love to volunteer at the Body Hacking Convention because I get to come here and interact with the coolest people, see some things that I don't normally see, learn some things I wouldn't normally learn. And I got an enhancement today. It's a magnet on my fingernail that allows me to randomly pick up metal objects. I didn't even know I needed that, but I got one, and I'm so excited that it was a free enhancement. And you too could come to the Body Hacking Convention and get a free enhancement.
Hi, I'm Tamara Banbury. I'm a master's student out of Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. This is my second time at the BDYHAX conference. Both times I do small presentations about cyborgs and body hacking and issues of identity. This year I'm talking about artificial intelligence and the kind of the ethics of integrating that type of technology into your body. And I'm just interested in whose ethics are we going to program? Who gets to decide what's right for everybody? And is society ready for this type of impact of AI?
My name's Radigan, and I am here to talk about cosplay, aesthetics, costuming, and fashion within the realm of body hacking.
So I'm Dr. Heather Barfield, and I'm actually I'm here wearing a lot of hats. I am the Associate Artistic Director and Development Director of the Vortex Theater. We're a very sex-positive theater company, so that may be of use for the Peep Show podcast. I'm also here on behalf of EFF Austin. We're sort of a local branch of a larger electronic frontier alliance. We advocate for civil digital liberties and your rights online in many ways. I'm obsessed with the body as a site of performance, whether it's to educate about political issues like feminist issues, like Karen Finley uses her body in interesting ways on stage, or with what Stellark's doing and showing like the expansiveness of the body in space and place, and how the body can be manipulated beyond utility, but actually for purposes of beauty or purposes of just mere exploration and innovation.
So my name is Aida. I'm here to disrupt the whiteness of the space and really look at the intersections of sexuality, technology, and mental health, since those are some of the adjacent conversations that I'm seeing here, but it doesn't seem like a lot of folks from those fields are necessarily in the space itself. So I wanted to come with my own set of knowledge and mix it in and remix it with the folks here.
Hi, I'm Jenny Huberman. I am a cultural anthropologist at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. And currently my research is focusing most broadly on transhumanism and understanding transhumanism as a contemporary sociocultural movement. My colleague Michelle Smirnova and I wrote a grant to come to the conference to study body hackers and get a better sense for the sort of DIY element of the transhumanist movement and how that differs from some of the other ways and places in which transhumanism is being promoted, namely Silicon Valley. So I'm here because I'm really interested in learning more about the DIY strand of the transhumanist movement.
Hi, my name is Michelle Smirnova. I am a sociology professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I am also here with Dr. Jennifer Humerman on a grant to study transhumanism and body hacking in general. I'm really interested in how people use technologies to both contest different socially constructed boundaries such as gender and race and sexuality, but how in using these technologies we also reify these very boundaries. So I'm interested in kind of how we're all cyborgs and fused with technology, and also those people who identify as a part of the transhumanist movement as somehow distinctively cyborgian.
We hope that gives you a flavor of some of this year's Body Hacks attendees. Stay tuned for interviews with Angel Giuffria and Hilary Malatino.
We are here at Body Hacks with Angel Giuffria, who is a bionic actress, congenital amputee, public speaker, cosplayer, and psych grad student. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So you've been hosting the event here for the last couple days, and there's been some really interesting conversations. But before we launch into all of that, I wanted to ask you about how you came to be here and maybe to tell us a little bit about your personal story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with my personal story because that kind of leads into why I'm here. So I was born without my arm. And I wear a prosthesis. I'm actually the youngest in the world to wear a myoelectric prosthesis, which means a muscle-controlled. Obviously, nothing to do with me. My mom's a badass. So pretty much, I was born without my arm. My parents had no idea. And just so happened, karma, my mom saw a documentary about the first ever hands being brought over from Canada and Germany for children. Had no idea I had one arm. So while she was on bed rest, I was born. One hand, and she started yelling about how there's a hand out there for her.
Whoa, that's a really interesting story.
Yeah, it's literally every time I tell people, they're like, no way, that's real.
It's like fate.
yeah, I swear this happened.
She was having this sort of like motherly intuition.
Yeah.
I was like,
well, it's so
what
funny
if my baby doesn't have a hand? Wow.
The doctors literally were like, this woman's like lost it, right? Because she's like, no, tiny arms. I've seen them. They have them. They're like, what did we give her? She's like, no, on TV there was a tiny arm. So she ended up finding the one place in the U.S. that was fitting children, which was in Houston, Texas. At the time, I lived in Baton Rouge, so it was only 4 hours away. So also, like, incredible luck.
Wow.
Yeah, so drove me out there. I got my first passive or non-moving hand to get used to, like, balance and dual grasping when I was 6 weeks old. A little chubby, tiny baby with a little bionic. And then I moved on to what was the early stage bionic hands. When I was 4 months, 10 days old, they put me in a muscle-controlled hand. Now, teaching someone to use one of these hands right now as an adult still isn't incredibly easy. But as a baby, obviously, you can't explain it. So what they did was with the sensors, they put one on my arm, and when I flexed the correct muscle, it would move a little race car.
Oh, wow.
So positive reinforcement to teach the baby how to do it. I wanted the race car to move, and that's how I did it. So I learned how to move the arm, and then when they put the arm on me, I already understood how it worked.
Oh, my God, that's so cool.
Right, I know. These people that come up with these things are brilliant.
Yeah,
but
we have a baby, and I'm trying to like imagine
just
him doing this. Yeah, it's amazing.
Tiny race car, I swear. But yeah, so fast forward, right, I went through all the iterations, the old school prosthetics were the cosmetic looking ones, right? They skin color glove that kind of look real, but don't really look real. It's the uncanny valley, where people don't exactly feel comfortable with it. So my whole life, I thought it was awesome. My mom was great at that. She was like, you are different, and that's awesome.
Yeah.
She wasn't one of those parents that were like, you're just like everybody else. Don't worry about it. Like, I'm not. And that's important.
Right.
That also led to me being the kid, like, I can take off my arm. Do you want to see? And everyone being like, they're like, no, it's cool. I promise. Like, So, I went through all those iterations, and in the last 10 years, they've had this amazing jump from these basic hands that were trying to blend in to these hands that they don't care if they stand out, which was kind of what I felt, because I have one arm and that's fine. I don't care if you know. So I started kind of embracing this idea. Instead of wearing the skin color gloves, my hand is black and white. I have different frame parts that cover my forearm that are colors from like silver to gold to right now I'm wearing a rose gold, and I have lights in it, and I have ones with Bluetooth speakers. And it was the idea of making something mine, even though it's not actually what someone else's hand looks like.
I think that's amazing. So your fingers move and you control that with your muscles. Can you
break it down?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'm sure you can hear it a little bit. But so how it works is there are two sensors. It's called a dual sensor control system that sit inside of the socket. The socket is the part that you fit your residual limb into. I'm considered short, so I have about 2-3 inches less than 3 inches after my elbow. Mm-hmm. So in there, they have these sensors that sit over your muscles, they're electrodes, and they pick up the electric impulses from your muscles. So whether that's a fast impulse or a slow impulse or a hard or a long, it determines the type of movement you're going to get, whether I'm going to hold an egg or whether I'm going to crush a can.
Yeah.
So, obviously I'm usually not trying to crush cans. It's not usually the goal, although when I was a kid, I had a lot of people run up like, crush this, crush this. Yeah. So I've been acting my whole life, and not until probably around the time right before I got this hand did I really consider it a possible career. I went into my undergraduate program for psychology. I've always been interested in people and how they respond and empathy and all those things.
Sure, yeah.
So acting and psychology are very linked. Once I graduated my undergrad, I was trying to get extra money for the grad school, and I started doing extra work in where I lived in New Orleans.
Okay.
And I was a background extra on Green Lantern, which not a lot of people have seen it, but it was the one with Ryan Reynolds. And we were doing this big classroom scene in a university, and they needed a featured extra part. And they came in, they chose 12 girls, and they came in, narrowed it down to like 6, and they came in, narrowed it down to 3. And at this point, it was taking like 3 hours, and I'm like, what are we doing? And I was wearing my cosmetic arm at the time because I didn't have this one yet.
Okay.
That looked more, more real.
Yeah,
And I had on a short sleeve shirt. So it was relatively noticeable. The director came in, Martin Campbell, has done like Casino Royale and like all the Bond movies.
Right.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Like,
Amazing movie.
yeah, he's fantastic. So he came in and like says her and just walks out. It's like, me? And then they're like, okay, get her into hair and makeup and this. And then I was like, wait, what am I doing? And they're like, you're going to be running in late for class. You got to throw open a door and blah, blah, blah. And there's going to be 3 shots of just you.
Okay.
And I was like, holy crap, they don't know I have one arm. I was like, what do you do?
Yeah.
So I did something that no extra ever does, is I went up to one of the production assistants and I was like, I need to speak to the director, to which I got laughed at. And then I was like, I have one arm. And they were like, be right back. So then Martin comes in and he's like, what's up? And I just launched into this long story about, I completely understand how film works. I've been doing theater my whole life. I get this. I don't, I would love to do this part, but just to let you know, I have one arm. And he kind of looks down and notices.
You probably had that all rehearsed.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, okay. Yeah, and I was like, I'd love to do this, but I get how it works. I am an extra. I'm not a principal actor in this. I don't want to distract the camera and whatever. If you want to pick someone else, that's fine. I totally understand.
Right.
And he kind of looked at me and he was like, have you ever been late for class before? And I was like, yeah. And it was like the simplest question, right?
Yeah.
Right. He goes, I don't see why you can't do this then, which I knew that. I knew that I've had one arm and I've been late for class before and it's not a big deal and I'm a real person and that should be represented. But I'd never seen that.
Yeah.
Never seen it on, think about all the films you've seen with one-handed people. Usually maybe they're the bad guy or they're this or, it's specifically focused on their hand. Rarely ever is it just a student late for class that happens to have one arm.
Right.
Yeah, so it was really cool. And he was like, I don't see why you can't do this. And that's when a light bulb kind of clicked. I was like, I do love acting. Maybe I'll try this.
Yeah.
So, fast forward, got this arm, worked on The Accountant, did a minor part in The Hunger Games. I have a new show coming out with Billy Bob Thornton that's Amazon. It's called Goliath. I'm in season 2. So just one episode, but I'm working on it. And that's the thing as an actor with a difference, we're trying to get in there. Diversity is such a big thing right now. But the idea is you need to represent things. So with Body Hacks, I've been coming now, circling around to Body Hacks. This is my 3rd year. It's the 3rd year of the conference. I love the people here. It is one of the most inclusive places, right?
Yeah.
You just come in and everybody wants to talk to you or get to know you, and it's...
Yeah, it has that kind of vibe, definitely, for sure.
Yeah.
We were talking the other night and someone was saying, it's one of these places where everyone makes eye contact.
Yes!
You walk into a room and
Why
everybody
not?
is just kind of looking to talk to everybody else.
Yeah, which is cool because they want to know what you're up to and what you've done and because we share the same interests.
Sure,
Which is so cool, which most conferences, you're like, oh, we do have the same interest, but it's different here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a self-motivated interest, right? It's
Right.
not like job, it's because you're passionate. So of
Yeah.
course you want to hear about other people. So 3 years ago, me, my friend Jason Barnes, who is also here, he's what people know as like the bionic drummer. He has a bionic drum arm. He has a really cool thing he's done with Georgia Tech recently with playing the piano and a single digit articulation hand.
Wow.
He's an acquired amputee, so he had lost his arm in an accident. So it was me, him, Rich Lee, who was here, who did the cyborgasm talk at SexTech. So it was all of us, and they did a cyborg panel. That was my first year. That was the first year of the conference, and I loved it. The audience was just so interested and receptive and had such great suggestions and on things that, why don't you try this, or thought my lights were cool. It was like, these are my people, like, you know? And then last year I hosted our tech fashion show, which was really, really cool. I got to see all these different fashions, and this is not just like your basic dress, right? These are like garments that change depending on the heat or the cold, or be able to share like whether someone's getting the goosebumps, or, you know, it's really cool stuff. So, and I got to wear this really awesome like LED lit couture dress. Like, it was amazing, which I'm not the most fashion oriented person, but that was cool.
Yeah.
And then this year I'm hosting the whole conference, which has been amazing to get to know all of these presenters and really like know what everything they've done.
So tell us, has it been hard to find acting roles, or like what's been the response from mainstream acting?
Right. So obviously, you know, people know what TV's like. You see high school students that are like, that's not what I look like in high school, right?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. And different things like that where you're wondering, is this really a representation of what the world looks like?
Right.
People with disabilities are a huge portion of the population.
Sure.
But if you watch a TV program, the likelihood that you're going to see a person with a disability on your TV is so small. The Ruderman Foundation did a study, and I think they said 2% of shows had a character with a disability.
Yeah.
And then even smaller was the character was actually played by a disabled actor.
Oh, yeah.
So that's been the frustrating thing is like, people be like, oh, I saw this new movie coming out. This girl has one arm in it or whatever. Did you audition for it? I'm like, no.
Yeah.
They didn't see any amputees for that. But yeah, it's been a challenge. Like my other acting friends, right? They talk about how they audition 4 or 5 times a week. Mm-hmm. They maybe book a couple, 3, 4 times a year, but
Sure.
they audition. They get so many opportunities to blow these people away. When I'm auditioning, I get 6 auditions a year, 7. Now, the likelihood that I book them is higher because it's written for practically me, because that's why I'm getting in there.
Right.
It's the only reason they're seeing me.
Yeah.
Is because it says she has a disability. She has one arm. She wears a bionic arm. That's a big one, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the reason I'm in there. So there's not that many of us that are actors, but there's enough,
Yeah.
right, that you should at least be seeing us or trying. So it's definitely gotten better, I would say, in the last 2 years. I've gotten a lot more auditions. My agent, who's at an agency in Los Angeles at KMR, they have a diversity division, which is the only agency that has that, where they literally have all these people that they're like, we're trying to diversify TV, and they put you out there for quote unquote normal roles, right?
Yeah.
You know, why can't I play a secretary? Why can't I play a nurse? I know a one-handed secretary and a one-handed nurse.
Yeah.
But the problem is casting directors don't see it that way, right?
Yeah.
They go, your audience is going to be confused. It's like, you're the one who sets the standard.
Right.
Media sets the standard, right?
Right.
I'm a camp counselor at an amputee kids camp, and I had one of my campers recently, like a 17-year-old girl, tell me she wanted to be a dental hygienist. As a one-handed person, right, you think, she could have so many attachments, that would work great, that'd be really cool.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in my mind whether she could do it,
Yeah.
or hers. The issue was she was worried about getting hired,
Right.
whether employers would be stressed out about that, or her capabilities,
Yeah.
as well as the patients, would they be uncomfortable?
Right.
And all you need, right, is one Grey's Anatomy, one TV show, one anything to
Right.
show a character doing that.
So,
And-
can I interrupt you for a
Yeah,
second?
absolutely.
Because we have a story, and we don't get to tell this story often.
let's hear it.
But I think it's super relevant. You're making me think. So a while ago, Jessie had to get surgery, and she has those kind of rolly veins where they have to stab you. Oh, like, you know,
I didn't know what story he was going to tell, but now I'm on.
5 or 6 times. And
Get
after.
the IV in.
Right.
After 2 nurses tried and poked you, like,
Blood was like dripping
Yep,
on the
I've
floor.
been there. Yep.
you know, like, I think it was like on the 5th try, finally they say, okay, we're going to have to bring in the
Nurse anesthetist.
nurse anesthetist.
We're
And
going to move up the ladder.
Yeah, 'cause
and so
they're-
we're like, okay, all right,
total
great.
badasses.
And the nurse anesthetist comes in like 10 minutes later, and I believe he was a ex-vet.
Yeah.
Comes in and he has one arm.
Does he?
And he does.
Has a prosthetic arm on, and it's his right arm, and so he comes next to me on the bed, and he lays his arm down, and he said, okay, the prosthetic one, and he said, okay, lay your arm over mine. So I do, and then I turn around because I don't like needles and I'm not looking, and then I realized he pulled his arm out of the prosthesis, used it as a prop, got it one stick, no problem.
See?
Turned around, put his arm back on, and was like, good to go.
See, it's so nice to hear, one, that he was employed, and two, that you weren't uncomfortable having him do it.
No.
But that's
and he
the
did a
thing.
great job.
Yeah, right.
And so for that 17-year-old girl out there,
yes,
totally possible.
Yeah, and see, that's the cool thing to hear. But like, representation is why people would be more comfortable with it. Because I'm gonna say you probably are in the minority, right? Because there are gonna be people that are gonna question that, right?
Right.
They're gonna walk in and they say, "Are they gonna make this worse?" You know.
It was interesting though that like we went through so many people, and then they're like, "Okay, bring him
Bring
in. He'll be able to do
the
it."
big guns, right? Yeah, yeah. I love that. That's nice to hear. Yeah. But yeah, so it would just, representation-wise, they just don't do enough of showing that, of showing real-life people. You know, you see a lot of Paralympic athletes, you see a lot of military vets, you see a lot of either like Kingsman-style bad guys or things like that. But why am I not seeing just real people? Like, why are they not seeing people with disabilities or amputees especially for roles that real people existed, you know?
Right.
So
that aren't just about that.
Yeah.
They're full
my whole life isn't about my arm, you know?
No.
Like, I talk about it quite a bit because it's cool. But, you know,
Right.
people I've met or that I've known for a long time, my arm rarely comes up. My friends forget half the time.
Right.
They're like, my friend the other day, we walked into a restaurant. She was like, you know what? I thought everyone was looking at us because we looked really cute. And then I realized your lights are on in your arm. And I was like, one of those things. Like, so I was like, oh, right.
Actually, those things aren't mutually exclusive.
Right.
I mean, that brings up another thing I kind of wanted to circle back to, and I think it's kind of both relevant to casting calls, but also just, I think, a broader question that I'm really interested in is like the way that you approach all of this. You know, we think about like standards of beauty in society, and we feel like often like there's this kind of box we know that people are expected to fit into. I think especially for like models and actresses, right?
Yeah.
And I guess you could, you know, wear like a realistic, I'm sorry, I forget what the word was.
Like
but
cosmetic
arm.
Or aesthetic.
All the time and try to blend in as much as possible. But it seems like you really don't do that, like that you actually really embrace the difference. And I've seen some of your cosplay and you like, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that, but like intentionally choose to cosplay things that accentuate your arm as opposed to take the focus off of it.
Yeah.
I believe recently you did a branch.
Yes, I did Finn from Adventure Time.
Yeah.
Or Fiona, I guess. I did the tree branch arm, yeah.
Yeah. And I just think that's like really interesting. It feels to me, and I don't know how you see it yourself, but that you're like really kind of playing with those standards of beauty and like asserting that different things can be beautiful than just like kind of what we normally expect. And they are, and they're really cool.
Right. I'm going to attribute that to my mom because, right, like I said, I always thought that my arm was cool. I always thought the lack of my arm was cool. I never thought there was an issue with my residual limb, what I refer to as my little arm.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where like I started to realize as I got older that maybe some people are uncomfortable by it. I remember the first time someone cried when I took off my arm.
Wow.
And because he thought it was gross. And I remember that was like the first time and I was like, what?
Yeah.
It never occurred to me, like, this is me, this is my body, like, I don't understand. And I think because I have a difference, I always thought differences were cool.
Yeah.
My mom would constantly talk about, like, if I saw somebody in the store that was in a wheelchair, I'd run up to them. Or if I saw somebody with dwarfism, or like a little person, I would go up and talk to them because I just wanted to talk about how we experience the world.
Right. Yeah.
Like, I want to hear about your experiences because I know how I experience. Like, let's talk about this because this is important. Even as like a little kid, like I just loved it because I loved finding someone else that kind of broke that mold.
Sure.
So as I got older and got into high school especially, I did wear the cosmetic devices. I did say, like, there was this idea in my head that I wanted people to meet me first and then see that I had one arm.
Yeah.
And it took probably until college for me to realize that is a huge part of me.
Right.
So to have them not know that up front is kind of, in my opinion, not actually meeting me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Right. So I started to feel like this is not something I want to hide. I'm tired of meeting someone, having a conversation, and going in the back of my head, did they notice my arm yet? Have they seen it yet? Do I need to tell them? Has it been too long? Are they going to feel like I lied to them? You know, because people get sometimes upset when I waited too long to tell them.
Wow.
Why didn't you say anything? Like, hi, my name's Angel. I have one arm. Like, what do you want? Like, so.
Right. That actually seems pretty unreasonable.
Right.
Like,
Yeah. So when I started wearing these hands that I consider beautiful, right? They're super tech looking.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I saw it come out, especially the small size, which is really recent, the first ever small size hand just came out 3 years ago. Like, ever. Before that, I was wearing hands that were 3 times the size of my hand.
Oh, wow.
If I wanted it to be multi-articulating and do all these functional things, it had to be huge because they're all designed for the 50 percentile male.
Oh, yeah.
There's not
That's
as many,
an interesting
not as
gender
many women.
question.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And design.
Right. So I started being able to look at things and say, like, I always thought differences are beautiful, but I was like, you know, I really get to act on this now. I'm not going to say that I'm the most confident person all the time. Everybody has their days, right?
Sure.
but it's not usually about my arm. Like within acting, right? I've been told to lose weight. I've been told this about your skin or your lips, or everyone finds something to pick at.
Right.
So usually most of my insecurities have been either not getting auditions because I have one arm, but it's never been the fact that I have one arm.
Right.
That's just me. Period. Like, and that's what I love, the fact that I am different, and I love, knowing people that are different, because I have all these other amputee friends as well as people with disabilities, and trying to showcase them and show the world like how beautiful differences are.
Right.
And the idea is like, the whole point is we're supposed to be different. If everybody was the same, the world would not work the same way.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like biologically, we are all meant to be different and embrace these differences. And so with my cosplays, I've always loved dressing up. That was like, a fun thing to do for me. Anytime I had an excuse to wear a costume, Halloween, whatever. I started working at a haunted house. It's one of the top-rated haunted houses in the country. It's in Baton Rouge. It's called the 13th Gate. And that was my first chance to really take my arm and use it. They were like, "Are you comfortable with this? Are you sure?" And I was like, "Yeah." I did an Evil Dead scene where I'm cutting off my arm in a kitchen.
Oh, whoa.
Awesome.
Yeah, I can give you the link if you want. It's pretty gory, guys. Remember, top haunted house, one of the top haunted houses in the country. But and it was so cool to me to say, you know what? This is an advantage in this situation.
Sure.
I'm
yeah.
going to use it as what it is. A lot of times people are like, "Oh, you take your disadvantage, make an advantage." It's not a disadvantage, it's just me. But I am making it advantageous in this situation.
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
I started researching heavily one-handed cosplay characters, which they're not that many.
Right.
Which gives you an idea of representation right there.
Right.
But there's not that many of them. So I started with, obviously, Evil Dead Army of Darkness chainsaw arm.
Yep.
That was my first one. And it went so well. I got put on Reddit by somebody else and it blew up. And Reddit has been super supportive of me, which is amazing, in talking about differences and diversity.
So PJ quoted Army of Darkness in our
Really?
wedding vows.
Yes! I love that. That's so amazing. Have you met Bruce Campbell? Have you gone to any cons to see him?
No, I haven't personally met him.
Yeah.
I did listen to his memoir
Yeah.
on audiobook.
You're like, I
think
practically
maybe
know
have
him.
seen him at a con. I've watched that. But anyways, yeah.
Yeah, he's great.
He's a funny guy.
Yeah,
But
he's
anyways,
so funny.
it's in our wedding vows.
I love that. Yeah, so I'll send you a photo later so you can see it. But it was my first one, right? I made the chainsaw out of like a dish detergent thing and started getting into cosplay and building things. Like I really loved the build aspect of it. The clothes part was cool,
Yeah.
But the build part, like making the cool devices to showcase, like I wanted people to know I had one hand.
Yeah.
The first time I went, people were like, "How do you have your arm in there?" And I'm like, I don't. I don't have my arm in there. Like, and people would be like, oh, like, because they're so used to seeing people with two hands
Right,
cosplay
right.
it. Bruce has two hands, right?
Right, yeah.
So,
Right.
technically that's a one-handed character that was played by a two-handed person, right?
Sure. Is there anything you want to say before you wrap this up?
I love this community. As a psychology major, right? I love these people that attend this conference because the inclusive vibe of it. It is such a rewarding situation to be here around people that are so interested in other people. So I love Body Hacking Con on the sense of being an actress and working towards representation. Like, if the only people fighting for it are the people that are in that situation, obviously that's a minority at that point, then it's kind of an uphill battle. But we
Right.
need other people like the people who attend Body Hack that are supporting this diversity and all these people. We need everybody else that is like, "I think bionic arms are cool," or "I think bionic limbs are cool." Then like shout that, tell
Yeah.
everyone, right? Because that's how we get people to work on them. That's how we get people to fund them. That's how they end up in, like, I did a Super Bowl commercial last year. That's how they end up in Super Bowl commercials,
awesome.
right?
Yeah.
So that's how you get these things on TV or represented in film or anywhere, is the interest. So on top of that, also, like, I want New York to look like New York, or I want my high school to look like my high school. Start casting more real people rather than
Right.
what you think they look like. So yeah, that's my soapbox.
No, that's amazing. So where can people find you?
On Twitter, I love Twitter. You'll hear me word vomit all day. It's Angel, AANNGGE, 4 L's. I made it when I was 19, and I'm never changing it. It's also that on Instagram, as well as you can find me on Facebook, private and public pages, Angel Giuffria.
It was really wonderful to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
So we are here today with Hilary Malatino, who works at Penn State, where they are an assistant professor in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, affiliate faculty in the Department of Philosophy, a research associate at the Rock Ethics Institute. Their research and teaching draws upon trans and intersex studies, critical sexuality studies, transitional feminism, disability studies, and medical ethics to theorize how experience of violence, trauma, and resilience play out in intersex, trans, and gender nonconforming lives. Their first book, Queer Embodiment, Monstrosity, Medical Violence, and Intersex Experience, examines the relationship between intersex embodiment, biomedical technology, and the forms of subjectivity both enabled and constrained by the medicalization of gender nonconformance. So welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we really enjoyed your talk. And I should also say that I liked reading your bio because my background is in women and gender studies and philosophy too. So
yeah.
So must play into why I liked your talk. But yeah, so
They're
first
the best disciplines, right?
Yeah, they are really. I mean, philosophy needs women and gender studies though to like ground it. Otherwise, it flies off into space.
That is for sure.
So tell us a little bit about how you got involved in the convention and your own history.
Yeah, so I was approached by Trevor Goodman, who is the person who is in charge of the convention, did all the event planning for it. They just wrote me out of the blue and were like, hey, I came across this article of yours. The article is called Biohacking Gender, and I thought you'd be a really good fit on this panel. And I was initially like, I wonder why? Because that article in particular was really just a pretty heavy-handed critique of the sort of commodified versions of biohacking that most folks are most familiar with.
Like, what are a couple of examples of that?
The company that was responsible for the bulletproof coffee craze, which is, I guess, just called Bulletproof, but they have a whole ensemble of products. So there's the coffee, then there are all of these nutraceutical supplements that come like attached with these promises that if you utilize these products, if you take these supplements, you'll be able to have much better cognitive functioning than you would otherwise. You can be at peak physical fitness and only sleep 5 hours a night. And they're also just exorbitantly and extravagantly expensive.
Sure.
So I began to think about who the sort of mainstream discourse on biohacking was being marketed towards.
Right.
And I basically argued that it was like a time-strapped, really heavily sort of cis male elite that was looking to enhance their bodies in ways that would essentially make them
more productive,
more effective, entrepreneurial, like, I don't know, superhumans in the context of late capitalism. And that was, I thought, pretty problematic, I guess, worth critiquing. So that was where the paper began. And then I also said, this ushers in an understanding of what a cyborg identity is that would make any scholar of Haraway like cringe, or at least render them highly skeptical. So
why do you think that is? Just because it's being like commodified, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Haraway's work was always very, very intensely critical of the commodification of technoscience in these ways that served capitalist patriarchy, right? I mean, she is maybe not a sort of party line socialist thinker, but her commitments are definitely anti-capitalist. Yeah.
We should step back, though, real quick and say we're talking about Donna Haraway, who, among many other things, wrote the Cyborg Manifesto, who was like a feminist author who I believe that was written in like 79, late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, and Haraway comes into it because that was actually when Trevor approached me. Trevor was like, we want a panel on Haraway's work and the legacy of Haraway's work for thinking about biohacking, sexuality, and technoscientific development.
Yeah.
That would have all been worth mentioning. But.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about your history and the work that you've done.
So I just wrapped up my first book, which is an enormous relief and also really exciting. And that book is the sort of short description of it that I give people is it's a critical genealogy of the last 50 to 70 years of intersex treatment in the United States. So I myself am intersex. I have androgen insensitivity syndrome. And the germ of the book began as I was trying to grapple with my own experience of the sort of medicalization of gender that comes along with an intersex diagnosis.
So what does that mean, androgen insensitive?
So that means that I have XY chromosomes, but my body doesn't respond to androgens.
Okay.
So essentially, when I was in the womb, I developed along relatively female typical lines. And it was only when I was, in sort of the midst of puberty and not menstruating that I was like, I think something's going on. This is strange. Went to a doctor. went to several doctors.
Yeah.
And eventually they came to this diagnosis.
Okay.
Somebody with XY chromosomes, body doesn't respond to androgens. They develop along female typical appearing lines, but are not able to reproduce, don't menstruate, etc.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And there are varying degrees of androgen insensitivity.
Okay.
So not everybody is completely androgen insensitive. A lot of folks are partially androgen insensitive.
Yeah.
And that's what I am. So that would produce some kind of corporeal gender non-normativity, I guess.
Okay.
It would make you sort of not typically, male or female.
Right. So you said that the germ of your book came out of your own experience. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I essentially, I went to the doctor and then I went to several other specialists, and they were all very intent on prescribing me conjugated estrogens and feminizing me, right, more intensively. And I was always pretty gender nonconforming and already was very sure that I was queer in terms of sexuality at this age.
Yeah.
So when I think of it now as sort of coercively feminized, right? I mean, it was presented as an option, but really the only feasible option if I wanted to have any kind of typical adolescence.
Oh, yeah. How old were you at that point?
I began seeing doctors when I was, I think, 14, maybe barely 15.
Yeah.
And then didn't receive the diagnosis until, I don't know, maybe 15, 16.
Yeah.
Late 15, 16. So a teenager.
Right.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Then I began to think, I'm not sure why it is that feminization is the only option for me.
Sure.
And then I started to read and try to uncover what the medical history of that was, right? That produced that limited set of options for me as I interfaced with doctors. And
so that was a very personal story that brought you to your research then.
Yeah. And I was actually warned against that later on because a lot of my mentors thought maybe this is too personal for you to be writing about. Maybe
that's the interesting
you're a little bit
thing
heavily
about
invested in it.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about academia too. I think that there's this fear of talking about anything that connects to you personally.
Yeah. When in fact, right, I think most people are interested in the research for reasons that are intensely personal.
Yeah. But Nietzsche said that every philosophy is an autobiography of its author. And I think that's true.
Yeah. I mean, how folks deal with that varies, but
sure.
Right.
Yeah. There's a real, I think, I don't want to say a dishonesty about that, but I think that we're encouraged to sort of play that down in the interest of some lingering investment in objectivity, which is problematic.
Yeah, I think that's problematic as well. So tell us a little bit about your book.
Yeah, so the book is based in archival research at the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. So Alfred Kinsey, for folks who aren't familiar with his work, is maybe the most well-known sexologist, certainly the most well-known sexologist in U.S. history.
Yeah. And
there are archives at Indiana University where all of his research is held, but also it's one of the largest sexological archives in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I went there to look at specifically the work of John Money, who was the sort of primary architect of intersex diagnosis in the United States. And all of his papers are there. So the book deals with John Money's research, and I basically just heavily critique his body of work and the diagnostic protocols that it led to.
Yeah, because he was an advocate of starting very, very young and pushing intersex children to one side of the binary or the other, right?
Right. And he had a constructivist approach to gender, but in a really limited way, where he thought gender was sort of indelibly imprinted, and that was the language that he used to describe it, by the age of 3.
Okay.
So you were able to construct it or socialize gender, but once you hit a certain developmental age that was really young, it was already sort of firmly established.
That's so wild. I can't even think of anything that's established by the time you're 3.
Right. Especially not something as complex as gender.
Right.
But it seems like some germ of that idea still persists, though, in the way we talk about things, but also in the kinds of narratives about gender, and particularly for trans youth, the emphasis on
knowing very young,
and that gender gets sorted out at a young age, because those are the stories that the media tends to focus on. So it seems like there's some line through that history to still how we're thinking about gender today.
Yeah. I mean, John Money worked really closely with Harry Benjamin. They founded the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic together in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And so that meant that intersex diagnosis was very much sort of wedded to trans diagnosis.
Yeah.
And a lot of the ideas were sort of co-constituting each other. So this idea that gender is determined at a very early age, although it might not be supported socially, totally has informed the history of trans diagnosis and what it means when you're trying to translate to medical professionals, right, what your trans identity might be. I mean, for a very long time, people have been forced to create really gender normative narratives that sort of retrospectively impose this like either neatly masculine or neatly feminine identity to the youngest age they can remember.
Yeah.
It becomes problematic when it gets enshrined in diagnosis and is like the way to access treatment, because it immediately makes treatment more difficult to access for folks who can't provide or haven't been coached to provide those kinds of narratives.
Right.
Right. So for trans folks, then, like, in order to access treatment or medicalized options that they might want, they would have to, like, embrace those narratives. But for intersex people, those kinds of treatments or medical options were sort of imposed upon them.
Right.
Like, they kind of had the opposite experience.
Right. And it was one of the main problems with it is it was the doctors, right, and the therapists involved in intersex diagnosis that were the ones who got to decide.
Right.
So they would interrogate intersex children, adolescents, and then gauge their responses to this long battery of questions, some of which were relatively invasive, right, about sexual fantasy, et cetera.
Right.
According to their ideas of masculinity and femininity, to make the sort of best guess as to what gender this person should inhabit.
Well, that's actually interesting, too, because that's like conflating gender and sexuality as well, then.
Yeah,
like,
that's what I was thinking.
If your fantasies are a particular way, they're assuming that that means something about your gender identity.
Yeah. I mean, it was all completely heterosexist, right? Like, the sort of earliest iterations of intersex diagnosis and trans diagnosis were just completely heterosexist.
Right. Yeah, I think that is, it is interesting how like tightly coupled those things were and how it's only in fairly recent history that we've been able to like pull those apart and say like, actually, gender identity is not the same thing as sexual orientation. And I don't think that a lot of people have done that yet.
Yeah. I don't think a lot of people have done that. I think one of the sort of most welcome developments, at least in terms of medicine and diagnosis, is that increasingly trans and queer people have gotten involved in the sort of medical apparatus and occupy this position of what Christoph Hansmann, who writes on trans healthcare, calls insider providers.
Oh,
so
okay. Yeah.
I think that's been an incredibly important development because it actually means that at least in certain clinics, there are folks who aren't completely clueless. Right, who are able to be critical of this long history of conflating gender identity with sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But that's a relatively recent development.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And it's interesting to think about like how these diagnoses impacted different people and different people across different sort of class and race lines too, because as you said, or as you hinted at when you were talking earlier, some people were better coached at how to navigate the medical system than other people were.
Yeah. And then some folks were just considered really, really poor candidates for transition because they were like too gender non-normative, too queer.
Yeah.
Or really simply, especially after these services were privatized, right? With the closure of the first sort of wave of university-run gender clinics in the 70s because they couldn't pay for transition.
Right.
Yeah. So I've been thinking a lot lately and in the new research, new writing I'm doing about what Adele Clark calls biomedical stratification or stratified access to biomedical technologies.
Yeah.
And I think the landscape of trans healthcare has just been so heavily constructed through this really rigidly stratified access that has links to like life chances and life outcomes for trans and gender nonconforming subjects too, right? Because passability is really related to survivability for a lot of people.
Yeah. How did the closure of those clinics, how did that affect healthcare for intersex people? Was it similar or did that?
No. So it's actually, they became, intersex persons and trans persons became sort of interpolated or included within medical systems in totally disparate ways. So like anecdotally, right, when I was a kid, I was on some sort of government subsidized healthcare. You'd have to ask my mother like what that was.
Sure.
But we were a relatively poor family and, I was on whatever healthcare that we could afford. And when it was sort of discovered that I was intersex, all of the treatment I received, right? So all of the tests, the blood work, the hormones that I was eventually prescribed, which I took for a little while and then stopped taking, that was all really, really minimal cost.
Right.
But my like lifelong best friend is a trans man, and at the same time that I was grappling with this intersex diagnosis, he was beginning to think about what his options were for hormonal transition. And, just had a nightmare of a time. This is in the late 90s and early 2000s, trying to get that covered and figuring out how he could get that covered, how he could access technologies of transition, because he was caught in this pay out of pocket, more heavily privatized system.
Do you think that the medical establishment, insurance companies and stuff thought of trans identity as some sort of choice and intersex identity as not one, that gave intersex people more access to better care than trans people? Or what do you think the division there is?
I think for sure questions of choice and therefore like questions of autonomy and agency in terms of how we embody gender were at stake. But I also think that there was this idea related to what you're saying, right? That in the popular imagination, trans folks were somehow going against nature, whereas intersex folks were like caught within this understanding that their bodies were naturally tending towards either a male identity or a female identity. And it was the job of the medical establishment to help them along.
So then the treatment was just like an augmentation of something that was happening already.
Right. So the language of being sexually unfinished was something that comes up in a lot of the intersex diagnostic literature. And that's something you never see in the literature on trans subjects.
Yeah.
Right? So that's instead framed as like a radical rebirth or an entirely new mode of being that the medical establishment is helping trans people realize, rather than like a little nudge along the way so they can be normal like everyone else.
Right.
I was wondering if it's also that intersex people were being treated as a biological problem, putting that in, air quotes, whereas trans people were being treated as like a social or psychological problem, again, in air quotes.
Right. In the history of trans medicine, there was this sort of war between the psychological approach, right, to trans treatment, which in the 50s and 60s was all about sort of putting trans people in therapy so they could come to terms with their biological sex.
Right.
And the approach sort of spearheaded by folks like Harry Benjamin and John Money, which was, there's no changing this gender identity, so that's why surgical intervention is important and hormonal intervention is important. So those were competing paradigms in the history of trans medicine for a really long time. And that meant that to a large extent, trans identity was steeped in sort of psychological pathology in a way that, intersex bodies weren't, because they were just seen as sort of natural aberrances or something. Natural deviance.
I wanted to make kind of a hard pivot to ask another question. We did not talk about the concept of monstrosity, and that seems to feature largely in the work you're doing now. So I want to understand how that fits into this whole conversation. Like, where do monsters fit in?
So I'm influenced by Donna Haraway's work, particularly this essay of hers called The Promises of Monsters, and also by Foucault's writing on monstrosity and hybridity. Both Haraway and Foucault make this argument that the sort of ability to inhabit monstrous forms of embodiment becomes increasingly less and less possible with the increasing sort of medicalization and institutionalization of, everything, right?
What would monstrosity look like, and how do we get away from that?
Yeah, so I think that monstrosity, the way that Foucault defines it, and the way that lots of folks have defined it, is really just tantamount to hybridity, right? A mixture of forms that is seen as violating like some sort of natural taxonomic logic.
Right.
Gotcha. So there's like certain categories we have as a society that are like common sense to us, and a monster is something that kind of, has a proverbial foot in both categories.
Right. So anything that violates the supposed natural order of things would constitute a monster.
Yeah.
So then you see, Foucault writes about disability, criminality, sexuality, and he's really intent on trying to figure out why it is that these sort of hybrid beings, or beings that supposedly violated, natural taxonomic logics, were the ones that were targeted by medical institutions, prisons, etc., and sort of modified or regulated or rehabilitated out of existence.
Yeah.
And I think like intersex bodies, it's like, oh, well, there's a great example of how that occurred. Right.
That is a really good example. Right. So the idea is that through this sort of forced medicalization, those bodies are getting weeded out or transformed into something more normative.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So the sort of main, if I could reduce the argument of the book down to like one or two sentences, it would be that the book's trying to chart how inhabiting an intersex body, like a legibly intersex body, became less and less possible over the course of the last 100 or so years.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And that's part of a broader historical trend, then, is what you're saying, where all of these powerful institutions in society tend to operate on a kind of logic or a way of thinking where they put everything into tidy categories. And so if something exists that doesn't fit into one of those tidy categories, then they figure out how to force it into one of those categories.
Right. And in the case of intersex folks, the logic was if we let intersex people inhabit these sort of visibly sex ambiguous bodies, then they have no place in the order of kinship, right? That governs social relations. They're not marriageable. They can't become part of the heterofamilial order.
Yeah.
So then the mission was to regulate them so that they could. And then the litmus test for how successful the medicalization of intersex conditions was basically, were intersex people able to be like the girl next door?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So going back to the conference, do you think that people who are really into body hacking then are somehow like rebelling against that normalization? Or do you think that's one way of looking at it? Or
is that the cyborg?
Yeah, like I'm just trying to think about it in relationship to that like thesis of your book.
So if we understand cyborg identity is just this embrace of the sort of merged natural cultural beings that we are, right? So cyborg identity refuses this division between the natural and the cultural, or the biological and the technical. If you embrace that, then when you think about it, everyone who's ever taken any kind of hormone, whether it's for the purposes of contraception or the purposes of gender transition, is deeply cyborgian, whether they realize it or not.
Right.
So
I mean, and there's hormones even in our water, or like artificial hormones, right? So when you say that, it's really all of us, because we all live in a society where we're being exposed to hormones or artificial things that to our body resemble natural hormones just by like existing.
Even simple things like fluoride in the water, things that are meant to like enhance what you have, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we're exposed to like this stuff all the time. So I guess like it's shaping us in all sorts of ways, yeah.
Right. So I think that, Haraway says in the Cyborg Manifesto that when she's theorizing the cyborg, it's not like some sci-fi future, like she's not talking about sex robots.
Right.
She's talking specific, or people interfacing with sex robots. I'm mentioning sex robots because that came up a lot at the conference.
It did, yeah.
So, but yeah, she says it's a general ontology.
I believe she calls it a blissed out techno bunny future.
Yeah, a blissed out techno bunny. Yeah.
Which I had to say just because she's hilarious.
She is hilarious and doesn't get enough credit for being hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, she says, no, it's not this like spectacular example, right? It's a general ontology. It's what all of us already are, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
So I think that that's where my work sort of veers over into body hacking, right? We think about body hacking as like, folks with magnetic implants, or like people who have developed their own system of insulin regulation that they can hold in the palm of their hand.
Sure,
those are all awesome examples, but there are way more sort of low tech or everyday examples of body hacking. Way more transformative than like a vibrating implant above one's penis, which is badass, I think, but also like...
Which was, for the people in the audience, one of the things that was talked about at the conference. Yeah.
Yeah, sex robots, vibrating implants. As I've been really interested in like trans for trans as a hashtag, right? Or a thing utilized, right, in the context of like hooking up. Because that just makes so vivid this idea that there are ways of understanding embodiment and eroticism that really are unique to trans experience.
Yeah.
And so much of the discourse has been historically about trans assimilation, particularly into like heterosexual culture.
Right.
That if we reframe eroticism along these lines of like trans folks desiring other trans folks, right?
Yeah.
It just opens up so much possibility, I think, and so much recognition of this really big sort of dissonance between cis embodiment and cis experience and trans experience.
Sure, yeah.
Not that that's a binary at all, right?
No, but I think that that's important because it points out that there is something like unique about that experience and that experience of one's own body if you're a trans person. That's hard for people outside of that to connect with in the same way.
What I've been interested in is how it makes the love of one's own trans body more possible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like radical and liberatory in and of itself.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, outside of any particular erotic or intimate relationship.
Right.
But yeah, that's what's been, I think, most valuable. Like the T for T thing has allowed me to think about how how difficult it is for trans and gender nonconforming and intersex folks to come to a place of sort of love and acceptance with their own body.
Right.
But also how one of the most effective ways of doing so is by being involved intimately in loving other non-cis bodies.
Right.
And non-cis
Yeah.
people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's also like a beautiful note to end on.
Yeah.
Is there any other things before we wrap up that you want to say or draw attention to?
Just that I really am very thankful that you all thought to interview me, and it was great. And I want to hang out with you all at some point in the future.
Yeah, let's definitely do that. Yeah, especially since we're so close. Where can people find your writing?
So you can find me online at hilarymalatino.com, and that would probably be the easiest place. And from there, you can see there will be links and PDFs of different articles of mine. My book should be out next fall.
Oh, that's
hopefully.
Exciting. Yeah.
So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah.
And yeah, the easiest way is just going online, though.
Okay.
Googling me, going to the website.
Yeah. All right. That's awesome. We totally enjoyed having you on the show.
I totally enjoyed being on the show.
Thank you.
Y'all take care.
Thanks. Bye.
We had a great time at Body Hacks this year. We appreciate all of the convention participants who chatted with us, and of course Trevor, Angel, and Hill for great interviews. You can find more info about the convention at bodyhackingcon.com. Stay tuned for the next episode when we get back to our on-site interviews from AVN. I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at Sabiotextual.
I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me at Peach Sage.
We would like to remind you that we do have a Patreon account, and we would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Thanks to Joe Kennedy for the music. The show is produced by Jessie and PJ Sage. Signing off. Have a great week.